The windshield wipers were losing the fight. Rain smeared the world into long, useless streaks of gray, and the Park Service F-250 slid along the road like it did not fully trust the ground beneath it. Sugarland stretched ahead as a black ribbon, slick and shining, the tires searching for grip every time I touched the brakes. The radio spat static, sharp and angry, until Cassidy's voice clawed through it in broken pieces. A family of 4. Missing. Schoolhouse Gap Trail. Dark had already settled in, the kind that presses close and listens. I tightened my hands on the wheel and kept driving, knowing this night was not going to let me turn back. My name is Earl Whitmore, and I have been a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 23 years. I have seen hikers wander off trails and emerge 3 days later, dehydrated but alive. I have recovered bodies from cliffs, from rivers, from places so deep in the wilderness that even the maps seem to forget them. I have heard the stories the old-timers tell around fires, stories about things that live between the trees, things that do not have names because naming them would make them too real. I never believed those stories, not until the Hargrove family vanished, and I found what they left behind. The Hargroves were from Ohio, Walter and Mildred, both in their early 40s, and their 2 children, a boy named Theodore, who was 12, and a girl named Constance, who had just turned 9. They had checked in at the visitor center that morning, signed the trail register with neat handwriting, and told the volunteer at the desk that they planned to hike to Schoolhouse Gap and back before sunset. Simple, safe. A trail I had walked 100 times without incident. But sunset came and went, and the Hargroves did not return to their campsite. Their rented minivan sat alone in the parking lot, rain pooling on its roof, and when the campground host called it in, Cassidy pulled me off my patrol and sent me into the dark. I parked at the trailhead and killed the engine. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the air felt heavy, thick with moisture and something else I could not name. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my radio, and stepped out into the night. The forest swallowed the beam of my light within 20 feet, the trees standing like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with water. I called out the names of the Hargroves, my voice echoing off the mountains and returning to me distorted, as if the forest was mocking my efforts. No response. Nothing but the drip of rain and the distant rush of a swollen creek. I started up the trail, my boots sinking into mud that grabbed at my ankles like desperate hands. The mist curled around the trees, ghostly fingers reaching for my face, and I found myself holding my breath at every turn, expecting to see something standing in the darkness. The Smokies have always felt alive to me, not in the way that other forests feel alive with birds and deer and the chatter of squirrels, but alive in a deeper sense, as if the mountains themselves are watching, waiting, remembering. That night, the watching felt closer than ever. That night, I could feel eyes on my back. An hour into the hike, I found the first sign of the Hargroves. A child's shoe, pink with white laces, lying in the center of the trail as if it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, searching for blood or damage, but it was pristine except for the mud on its sole. Constance's shoe. I called her name, louder now, desperation creeping into my voice. The forest answered with silence. I radioed Cassidy and told her what I had found. She said she was sending backup, but the nearest team was an hour away, maybe more with the roads in this condition. I told her I was going to keep moving. She hesitated, and I heard the concern in her static-laced voice, but she knew better than to argue. In the Smokies, time is the enemy. Every minute a person is lost is a minute closer to hypothermia, to injury, to something worse. I pressed on. The trail climbed higher, winding through stands of hemlock and rhododendrons so thick that my flashlight could not penetrate them. The mist grew denser, and I began to see shapes in it, suggestions of movement that vanished when I turned my head. I told myself it was my imagination, the product of exhaustion and adrenaline, but my hand found its way to the bear spray on my belt and stayed there. Bears do not usually bother humans in these mountains, but there are other things in the forest, things that hikers glimpse from the corners of their eyes and never speak of afterward because they do not want to be called crazy. At the 2-mile marker, I found Walter Hargrove's jacket. It was draped over a fallen log, its sleeves arranged as if someone had carefully removed it and laid it out to dry. I checked the pockets and found a wallet, a set of car keys, and a folded piece of paper. I unfolded the paper and held my flashlight close. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting that barely resembled the neat script from the trail register. The note said only 3 words: "We are being followed." My blood went cold. I scanned the forest around me, my flashlight cutting wild arcs through the mist, but I saw nothing, heard nothing. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that should not exist in a forest at night. No insects, no owls, not even the drip of rain, just the pounding of my own heart and the rasp of my own breath. I called the Hargroves' names again, and this time, something answered. It was not a voice, not exactly. It was a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a low vibration that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. It rose and fell like breathing, like something impossibly large drawing air into lungs that had no business existing. The sound lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and then it stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt like a wound. I stood frozen on the trail, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get back to my truck and drive until the mountains were nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. But I thought of Theodore and Constance, of 2 children somewhere in this darkness, frightened and alone, and I forced my legs to move. I have always believed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. That night, I discovered just how much fear a person can carry and still keep walking. The trail leveled out as I approached the gap, and the mist began to thin. I could see farther now, maybe 30 or 40 feet, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. There was a structure ahead, just off the trail to the left, a cabin that I had never noticed in all my years of patrolling this area. It was old, impossibly old, its logs blackened with age and its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. There was a single window facing the trail, and through that window I could see the flicker of light. I approached slowly, my hand still on my bear spray, my flashlight trained on the cabin door. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges, and from inside came the smell of smoke and something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger, asking if anyone was inside. The flickering light continued, but no one answered. I pushed the door open with the toe of my boot and stepped inside. The cabin was a single room, maybe 15 feet square, with a dirt floor and walls lined with shelves. The shelves held jars, dozens of them, filled with liquids of various colors, and floating in those liquids were things I did not want to examine too closely. The light came from a candle on a rough wooden table in the center of the room, and sitting at that table, facing away from me, was a figure in a dark coat. I called out again, louder this time, and the figure did not move. I circled the table slowly, my flashlight joining the candle's glow, and when I saw the figure's face, I had to bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. It was not a person. It was a thing made to look like a person, a construction of sticks and mud and animal bones arranged in the rough shape of a human body. Its face was a wooden mask, crudely carved, with empty holes where the eyes should be, and hanging from its neck on a length of frayed rope was Mildred Hargrove's wedding ring. I took the ring with trembling hands and backed out of the cabin. I did not want to turn my back on that thing at the table, even though I knew it was not alive, could not be alive. I stepped onto the trail and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, trying to clear the stench of the cabin from my lungs. My radio crackled, and Cassidy's voice came through, asking for my status. I told her where I was. I told her about the cabin. I told her about the ring. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She said there was no cabin on Schoolhouse Gap Trail. There had never been a cabin on Schoolhouse Gap Trail. I turned around, my flashlight raised, ready to prove her wrong. But the cabin was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a clearing, a patch of bare earth surrounded by rhododendrons, as if nothing had ever been built there. I walked to the center of the clearing and looked down. The ground was undisturbed, covered with a carpet of dead leaves and fallen branches. No foundation, no stones. No sign that any structure had ever existed in that spot. But in my hand, I still held Mildred Hargrove's wedding ring, the inscription on its inside band catching the light of my flashlight, M&W Forever, 1987. I do not remember the hike back to the trailhead. I have fragments, images of trees and mist and my own boots moving through mud. But the journey itself is a blank spot in my memory, as if my mind decided that some things are better left unremembered. I reached my truck just as the backup team arrived, 3 rangers from the Cades Cove station who had driven through the night to help with the search. I showed them the shoe and the jacket and the ring. I told them about the cabin that had vanished. They exchanged looks that I recognized, the looks that people give when they think someone has lost their grip on reality, but are too polite to say so. We searched through the night and into the morning. We brought in dogs and helicopters and volunteers from Gatlinburg. We covered every inch of Schoolhouse Gap Trail and the surrounding wilderness, an area of nearly 10 square miles, looking for any trace of the Hargrove family. We found nothing, no bodies, no more clothing, no sign that 4 human beings had ever walked into those woods. The Hargroves had vanished as completely as the cabin, swallowed by the forest, as if they had never existed. The investigation lasted 2 weeks. Detectives from Sevier County interviewed the campground host, the volunteer at the visitor center, other hikers who had been on the trail that day. They traced the Hargroves' movements from Ohio to Tennessee, documented every stop they had made along the way, built a timeline so detailed that they could account for every hour of the family's last day. But the timeline ended at the trailhead, at the moment when Walter and Mildred and Theodore and Constance stepped out of their minivan and started up the path to Schoolhouse Gap. After that, there was only silence. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation, though everyone involved knew that classification was a formality. In the mountains, missing persons are usually found within 72 hours, one way or another. The Hargroves were never found at all. Their minivan was towed, their campsite was cleared, their names were added to a list that I kept in a locked drawer in my office, a list of people who had walked into the Great Smoky Mountains and never walked out. By the time I added the Hargroves, there were 17 names on that list. 17 mysteries that the forest had decided to keep for itself. I should have let it go. I should have filed my reports, attended the debriefings, and moved on with my duties the way I had after every other disappearance. But I could not stop thinking about the cabin. I could not stop seeing that wooden figure sitting at its table, Mildred's ring hanging from its neck like a trophy. I could not stop hearing that sound, that impossible breathing that had seemed to come from the forest itself. Something was out there, something that did not belong in any natural order, and it had taken a family of 4 as easily as a hawk takes a mouse. I started doing research. I dug through the archives at the park headquarters, reading reports that went back to the founding of the park in 1934. I visited the library in Gatlinburg and requested old newspapers from the surrounding counties. I talked to retired rangers, to historians, to Cherokee elders who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told them about the mountains. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to assemble a picture of something that had been hiding in plain sight for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The disappearances had been happening for generations. In 1952, a honeymooning couple from Nashville had vanished near the Alum Cave Bluffs. In 1968, a group of Boy Scouts had gone missing during a camping trip to Clingman's Dome. In 1979, a solo hiker named Clarence Whitfield had walked into the Cataloochee Valley and was never seen again. The stories went on, stretching back further than the park itself, back to the days when the mountains were home to small farming communities and logging camps. In 1891, an entire family of 7, the Thorntons, had disappeared from their cabin near what is now the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. Their cabin was found intact, their dinner still on the table, their livestock still in the barn. But the Thorntons themselves were gone, leaving behind only a single piece of evidence. A wooden figure, made of sticks and mud and animal bones, sitting in a chair by the fireplace. I found a photograph of that figure in a dusty folder at the Sevier County Historical Society. The photograph was faded and cracked, but the image was clear enough to make my blood run cold. The figure was identical to the one I had seen in the vanishing cabin on Schoolhouse Gap Trail. The same rough construction, the same wooden mask with its empty eye holes, the same posture of terrible patience, as if it was waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The photograph had been taken in 1891, more than a century before the Hargrove family walked into the forest, and yet the figure in the photograph could have been a twin of the one I had encountered. I showed the photograph to my supervisor, a man named Harold Jennings, who had been with the Park Service for nearly 40 years. Harold looked at the picture for a long time without speaking, and when he finally raised his eyes to meet mine, I saw something in them that I had never seen before. I saw fear. He told me to stop digging. He told me that some questions do not have answers, or at least not answers that anyone should want to find. He told me about a ranger named Ezekiel Post who had worked in the Smokies back in the 1970s, a man who had become obsessed with the disappearances and had spent years trying to find the truth. Ezekiel had eventually found something, Harold said, something that had changed him. He had resigned from the Park Service in 1978 and moved to a cabin in the mountains of North Carolina, where he lived as a hermit until his death in 1996. In the 18 years between his resignation and his death, Ezekiel Post never once set foot in the Great Smoky Mountains. He told people that the mountains had shown him something, and that something had been looking back. I asked Harold if he knew what Ezekiel had found. Harold shook his head and said that Ezekiel had refused to talk about it, had become agitated and paranoid whenever anyone mentioned the Smokies in his presence. The only clue he had ever given was a phrase he repeated over and over in his final years, a phrase that his caretakers had recorded in their notes: "The hollow ones are waiting." I left Harold's office that afternoon with more questions than I had started with, but also with a destination. Ezekiel Post's cabin was still standing, according to county records, and his estate had never been settled. His few belongings were still inside, untouched for nearly 3 decades, preserved by isolation and the dry mountain air. If Ezekiel had found something in the Smokies, there might be evidence of it in that cabin, notes or photographs or artifacts that could help me understand what I was dealing with. I told Cassidy I was taking a week of personal leave. I packed a bag, loaded my truck, and drove east toward the mountains of North Carolina. The road to Ezekiel Post's cabin was barely a road at all. It was a dirt track that wound up the side of a mountain, overgrown with weeds and blocked in places by fallen branches. My truck's suspension groaned as I navigated the ruts and holes, and more than once I had to get out and move debris by hand just to continue forward. The forest here was different from the Smokies, darker and denser, the trees pressing so close together that their branches formed a canopy that blocked out the sky. It felt like driving into a tunnel with no end, a passage from one world into another. The cabin appeared without warning, a small structure of weathered gray wood perched on a ledge overlooking a valley so deep and shadowed that I could not see its bottom. The windows were dark, the door was closed, and the whole place had an air of abandonment that went beyond mere disuse. It felt as if the cabin had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to finally arrive. I parked my truck and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. Then I got out and walked up the overgrown path to the door. The door was not locked. It swung open at my touch, revealing a single room filled with shadows and dust. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cabin was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a wood stove in one corner and a narrow bed in another. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were lined with books, hundreds of them, their spines cracked and faded with age. There was a desk beneath the single window, and on that desk, I found what I was looking for. Ezekiel Post had left behind a journal. It was a thick volume bound in leather, its pages filled with handwriting that grew progressively more erratic as I turned from one entry to the next. The journal covered the years from 1971 to 1978, the period when Ezekiel had been actively investigating the disappearances in the Smokies. I sat down at the desk, turned on the lamp that somehow still worked after all these years, and began to read. The early entries were methodical, almost clinical. Ezekiel had been a careful researcher, documenting every disappearance he could find, mapping the locations, looking for patterns. He had discovered what I had discovered, that the disappearances went back generations, that they seemed to cluster in certain areas of the park, that witnesses sometimes reported strange sounds or sightings in the days before a disappearance occurred. He had also discovered something I had not. The disappearances followed a cycle. Every 19 years, Ezekiel wrote, the forest takes its due. He had traced the cycle back to the earliest recorded disappearance, a Cherokee woman who had vanished from her village in 1798, and he had tracked it forward through history, noting how each cycle seemed to last for approximately 1 year before falling dormant again. During active years, the disappearances increased dramatically, sometimes numbering in the dozens. During dormant years, they slowed to a trickle or stopped altogether. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Something was waking in those mountains, something that hungered in 19-year intervals, and when it woke, people died. As I read further into the journal, Ezekiel's tone began to change. The clinical detachment gave way to something more personal, more urgent. He described expeditions into remote areas of the park, areas that most rangers avoided because of their difficulty and their reputation. He described finding things in those areas, clearings where the trees grew in perfect circles, caves that went deeper than any cave had a right to go, structures made of sticks and mud and bone that appeared and disappeared with no explanation. He described hearing sounds at night, sounds that did not match any animal he knew, sounds that seemed to follow him from one campsite to the next. And he described seeing the hollow ones. That was the phrase Harold had mentioned, the phrase that Ezekiel repeated in his final years. The hollow ones are waiting. In the journal, Ezekiel described them in vivid, terrifying detail. They were figures that looked almost human, but were not. They moved through the forest at night, silent and purposeful, their bodies jerking and twitching as if controlled by invisible strings. They had no faces, or rather, they had faces that were blank, smooth expanses of pale flesh with no features at all. They gathered in groups, standing motionless among the trees, and they watched. They always watched. Ezekiel believed they were scouts or servants, extensions of something larger, something that slept beneath the mountains and used them as its eyes and hands. The final entries in the journal were almost illegible, the handwriting so shaky and cramped that I had to hold the pages close to my face to decipher them. Ezekiel had found something in 1978, something in a cave near Charlie's Bunyan, a rocky outcrop on the Appalachian Trail. He did not describe what he found in detail, but he described his reaction to it. He wrote about running, about fleeing through the forest in blind panic, about reaching his truck and driving for hours without stopping. He wrote about the dreams that followed, dreams of standing in a great darkness while something moved toward him, something so vast and ancient that his mind could not process its shape. And he wrote, in the very last entry, that he was leaving the park forever, that he could not stay in a place where he had seen what slept beneath the trees. Below the final entry, Ezekiel had drawn a map. It was crude, sketched in haste, but I recognized the landmarks. It showed a path from Newfound Gap to Charlie's Bunyan, and then another path, one not marked on any official trail map, that led from Charlie's Bunyan into the wilderness toward a location marked only with a single word: source. I closed the journal and sat in silence as the daylight faded outside the cabin's window. I understood now why Harold had warned me to stop digging. I understood why Ezekiel had fled and never returned. The mountains held something terrible, something that defied explanation, and I was drawing closer to it with every question I asked. The smart thing to do would be to leave, to put the journal back where I found it and drive away and never think about the Smokies again. But I thought about the Hargroves, about Theodore and Constance, about 17 names in a locked drawer, and I knew that I could not walk away. If there was a source to all this suffering, I had to find it. I had to understand it. And if there was any way to stop it, I had to try. I spent that night in Ezekiel's cabin, lying on his narrow bed with the journal clutched to my chest. I did not sleep well. The mountain was too quiet, the silence too complete, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw wooden masks with empty eye holes staring at me from the darkness. When morning finally came, I packed my things, took the journal, and drove back toward the Smokies. I had a map now, and I had a destination. I was going to find what Ezekiel had found in that cave near Charlie's Bunyan. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I told Cassidy that I was extending my leave, told her that I needed more time to deal with some personal matters. She did not ask questions, though I could hear the concern in her voice. She had known me long enough to recognize when I was hiding something, but she also knew me well enough to know that I would tell her when I was ready. I was grateful for her trust, even as I wondered if I was betraying it by going into the forest alone. The hike to Charlie's Bunyan took most of a day. The trail was steep and rocky, climbing through dense forest before emerging onto the exposed ridgeline where the bunyan jutted out like a fist of broken stone. I stood on that outcrop as the sun began to set, looking out over miles of unbroken wilderness, and I felt the enormity of what I was attempting. The mountains went on forever, ridge after ridge fading into the blue distance, and somewhere in all that vastness was something that had been taking people for centuries. Finding it seemed impossible. Surviving the finding seemed even more so. But Ezekiel's map was clear. From Charlie's Bunyan, I needed to leave the trail and head northeast, following a creek bed that would eventually lead to a ravine. At the head of the ravine was a cave, and in that cave was the source. I checked my gear, tightened the straps on my pack, and stepped off the trail into the wilderness. The forest closed around me like a door shutting. Within minutes, the trail was invisible behind me, swallowed by undergrowth and the failing light. I followed the creek as Ezekiel had instructed, scrambling over moss-covered boulders and wading through sections where the water ran too deep to avoid. The air grew colder as I descended into the ravine, and the trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and ancient, their branches reaching toward each other like the fingers of clasped hands. It was the kind of forest that existed before humans, the kind that remembered what walked these mountains when the world was young. I made camp as darkness fell, choosing a spot beneath an overhang that would protect me from rain. I ate without tasting, drank without thirst, and tried to ignore the sounds that had begun to filter through the forest around me. They were subtle at first, just hints of movement in the brush, the crack of a twig here or the rustle of leaves there. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew more deliberate. Footsteps circled my camp, slow and measured, always just beyond the reach of my firelight. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger, demanding that whoever was out there show themselves. The footsteps paused, and then resumed, closer now, as if my voice had drawn them in rather than frightened them away. I did not sleep that night. I sat with my back to the rock and my flashlight in one hand and my bear spray in the other, watching the darkness and waiting for something to emerge from it. Nothing did. The footsteps continued until just before dawn, and then they stopped, as suddenly as if a switch had been thrown. When the sun rose and I dared to examine the ground around my camp, I found tracks. They were shaped like human footprints, but longer, narrower, with no arch and no definition in the toes. They looked like the prints of feet that had been flattened, pressed down by some tremendous weight until all their natural contours had been erased. I broke camp and continued down the ravine. The cave appeared around mid-morning. It was not large, just a dark opening in a wall of rock, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. I would have walked right past it if not for Ezekiel's map, which marked the entrance with a small X and the words, "Here be the sleeping." I pushed aside the vines and shone my flashlight into the darkness beyond. The cave went back maybe 20 feet before narrowing to a passage that angled downward into the earth. The walls were damp and covered with a pale fungus that glowed faintly in the beam of my light, giving the whole space an eerie, bioluminescent sheen. The air smelled of minerals and decay, and beneath those smells, something else, something alive and waiting. I hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct told me to turn back, to return to the surface and forget I had ever found this place. But I thought of the Hargroves again, of Theodore's baseball cap and Constance's pink shoe, of a family that had simply wanted to take a walk in the woods. I thought of Ezekiel Post, who had run from this cave and spent the rest of his life haunted by what he had seen. I did not want to run. I did not want to spend my remaining years looking over my shoulder, wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to see this through. I took a deep breath, ducked my head, and entered the cave. The passage descended for what felt like miles, though it could not have been more than a few hundred feet. The walls pressed close, forcing me to turn sideways in places, and the ceiling dropped so low that I had to crawl on my hands and knees. The glowing fungus provided just enough light to see by, which was almost worse than complete darkness. I could see the shapes of things on the walls, carvings or markings that I did not recognize, symbols that seemed to squirm and shift when I looked at them directly. I kept my eyes forward and kept moving. The passage finally opened into a chamber. The chamber was vast, far larger than any natural cave had a right to be. My flashlight could not reach the far wall, could not even suggest where the far wall might be. The floor was smooth and sloped gently toward a central depression, like the bowl of an enormous amphitheater. And in that depression, filling it completely, was something that my mind refused to process. It was like looking at a shadow that had taken on weight and mass. It was like looking at the negative space between stars. It was a shape, but not a shape I could describe with any language I knew. It was alive, but not alive in any way that corresponded to the life I understood. It lay coiled in the depression, and even in its stillness, I could feel it moving, growing, dreaming. It was the source of everything. It was what slept beneath the mountains, what woke every 19 years, what sent its hollow servants into the forest to gather what it needed. I do not know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. Time had no meaning in that chamber, no purchase, nothing to cling to. I only know that at some point, the thing in the depression became aware of me. I did not see it move. I did not see it open any eyes. But I felt its attention land on me like a physical weight, pressing me down, pinning me in place. It was curious. It was hungry. And it was very, very old. I ran. I do not remember the passage back to the surface. I do not remember scrambling out of the cave or pushing through the vines or climbing up the ravine. I have fragments, just as I had fragments from the night the Hargroves disappeared. But the journey itself is a blur of panic and darkness and the absolute certainty that something was following me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and then I crawled, and when I could not crawl anymore, I lay face down in the leaves and waited for whatever was chasing me to finally catch up. But nothing caught me. I lay there for hours, trembling and weeping, and nothing emerged from the forest to claim me. When I finally found the strength to stand, I was alone. The forest was quiet, and the sun was high, and the mountains looked exactly as they always had, beautiful and ancient and utterly indifferent to my terror. I made my way back to the trail and hiked out to my truck. The journey took 2 days, and I do not remember eating or sleeping during that time. I only remember walking, one foot in front of the other, my mind carefully blank, refusing to process what I had seen in that chamber. When I finally reached the parking lot at Newfound Gap, I sat in my truck for an hour before I could bring myself to turn the key. I drove home. I showered. I slept for 18 hours. And when I woke, I wrote down everything I had experienced, just as Ezekiel had written in his journal. I wrote about the cave and the chamber and the thing in the depression. I wrote about the hollow ones and their blank faces. I wrote about the cycle, 19 years of sleeping and 1 year of waking, and about the terrible hunger that drove it all. And then I did something that Ezekiel had not done. I started making a plan. I knew that I could not face the thing beneath the mountains alone. Whatever it was, whatever power it possessed, it was beyond anything a single person could challenge. But I also knew that running was not an option. The cycle was continuing. People were still disappearing, and if Ezekiel's calculations were correct, we were entering an active year, a period when the disappearances would accelerate until the thing's hunger was satisfied. I needed help. I needed people who understood what we were dealing with, people who had seen the hollow ones or survived encounters with the forces that served the sleeping thing. I needed, in short, to find others like me. The search took months. I combed through old reports and newspaper archives looking for cases where witnesses had described phenomena similar to what I had experienced. I reached out to former rangers, to historians, to anyone who might have knowledge of the deeper mysteries of the Smokies. Most of my inquiries went unanswered or were answered with polite dismissals. A few led to conversations that went nowhere, interviews with people who had experienced strange things but were not willing to discuss them further. But slowly, person by person, I began to assemble a group. The first to join me was a woman named Clementine Barkley, a retired schoolteacher from Maryville, who had lost her brother in the mountains in 1959. She had been 12 years old at the time, and she had never stopped searching for answers. Her brother, a young man named Ernest, had gone fishing on a remote stretch of Little River and had never returned. His body was never found, but Clementine had found something else. 3 days after Ernest's disappearance, walking the banks of the river where he had last been seen, she had encountered one of the hollow ones. She told me about it in her kitchen, over cups of coffee that went cold as she talked. The hollow one had been standing in the river, she said, up to its waist in the current, its blank face turned toward her. It had not moved. Not even when she screamed and ran. But she had felt its attention, the same crushing weight that I had felt in the cave. She had never told anyone about it, not her parents, not her husband, not her children. She had carried the memory alone for more than 60 years, and hearing my story was the first time she had ever felt believed. The second to join was a man named Obadiah Fletcher, a Cherokee historian who had devoted his life to preserving the stories and traditions of his people. Obadiah knew more about the mountains than anyone I had ever met, and he knew about the thing beneath them. His people had a name for it, a name that translated roughly as the one who waits. According to Cherokee legend, the one who waits had been here since before the mountains themselves, since before the land rose from the sea. It had made a bargain with the first people who lived here, a bargain that required tribute in exchange for peace. The tribute was taken every generation, and in return, the mountains remained safe for everyone else. Obadiah believed that the bargain had been broken. Somewhere in history, someone had failed to pay the tribute, and the one who waits had grown angry. It no longer accepted what was offered. It took what it wanted, when it wanted, and its hunger had grown with every passing cycle. The disappearances were not random, Obadiah said. They were punishments, reminders, warnings of what would happen if the debt remained unpaid. The third to join was a young man named Sebastian Reed, a graduate student in folklore who had been researching Appalachian legends for his dissertation. Sebastian had come across references to the one who waits in obscure sources, mentions of it in the journals of early settlers and the oral traditions of mountain communities. He had initially dismissed these references as superstition, the product of isolated communities making sense of unexplained tragedies. But then he had visited the Smokies to conduct field research, and on his very first night in the mountains, he had heard the breathing. It had come from all around him, Sebastian told me, rising and falling like the tide. It had lasted for hours, and in the morning, his campsite had been surrounded by tracks, the same flattened footprints I had found around my own camp. He had packed up immediately and driven back to Knoxville, but he could not stop thinking about what he had heard. When he came across my queries in the course of his research, he had reached out immediately. The four of us met for the first time in a diner in Townsend, a small town on the western edge of the park. We sat in a back booth with the blinds drawn and talked for hours, sharing our experiences and comparing our knowledge. By the end of the conversation, we had agreed on two things. First, the thing beneath the mountains was real, and it was waking. Second, we had to find a way to stop it. Obadiah was the one who proposed the solution. His people had stories, he said, about others who had faced the one who waits, ancestors who had found ways to appease its hunger without sacrificing human lives. The methods had been lost over generations, forgotten or suppressed by well-meaning missionaries who had viewed the old practices as pagan and dangerous. But there might be traces of them in the oldest stories, hints that could point us toward a way of closing the door between our world and whatever world the one who waits called home. We divided the work among ourselves. Sebastian would continue his research, focusing on folklore and legend, looking for any story that might contain a clue. Clementine would search the historical records, trying to find accounts of past cycles and how they had been ended. I would continue my exploration of the park, mapping the locations of disappearances and looking for patterns that might reveal the boundaries of the thing's influence. And Obadiah would consult with the elders of his tribe, seeking any knowledge that might have survived the centuries. We agreed to meet again in 1 month, and we went our separate ways. The next 4 weeks were the most intense of my life. I requested a leave of absence from my job, citing personal reasons, and I threw myself into the work with a desperation that bordered on obsession. I hiked every trail in the park, visited every location where a disappearance had been recorded, and documented every anomaly I encountered. I found more of the wooden figures scattered throughout the wilderness, some ancient and others recently made. I found more of the clearings where the trees grew in perfect circles, places where the forest felt wrong in ways I could not articulate. And I found more of the tracks, the flattened footprints that seemed to appear wherever the hollow ones walked. The pattern emerged slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself from scattered fragments. The disappearances were not random. They clustered around specific locations, places where the boundary between our world and the thing's world was thinner than elsewhere. Schoolhouse Gap was one such location. So was Alum Cave Bluffs. So was Klingman's Dome and Cataloochee Valley and half a dozen other spots scattered throughout the park. These were the places where the one who waits could reach through most easily, where its servants could enter our world and do its bidding. But there was another pattern, one that I had not expected. The disappearances did not just cluster in space, they clustered in time, in specific nights that corresponded to phases of the moon. Every recorded disappearance I could find had occurred within 3 days of a new moon, when the night was darkest and the boundary between worlds was weakest. It was during these periods that the Hollow Ones became most active, most visible, most dangerous. I shared my findings with the others at our second meeting. Sebastian had found references to the moon's importance in several folk tales, descriptions of rituals that had to be performed in complete darkness to be effective. Clementine had found historical accounts of communities that had avoided traveling through the mountains during new moons, traditions that had been dismissed as superstition, but now seemed like survival strategies. And Obadiah had spoken with an elder who remembered a story about a portal, a door that opened beneath the mountains when the moon was gone and closed again when the light returned. The pieces were coming together. The one who waits was not simply a creature living beneath the mountains. It was something from another place, a place of darkness and hunger. A place that touched our world only at certain times and in certain ways. The Hollow Ones were its servants, physical manifestations of its will, sent through the door to gather what it needed. The wooden figures were markers, or perhaps anchors, things that kept the door open and allowed the thing's influence to spread. If we could find the door and close it, we might be able to stop the cycle. We might be able to save the people who would otherwise disappear. We might be able to end centuries of suffering. But first, we had to find the door. I knew where to look. The cave near Charlie's Bunyan, the place where Ezekiel had found the sleeping thing. That was where the door had to be. The chamber I had seen. The vast space that seemed to go on forever. That was not a natural formation. It was a threshold. A place where two worlds met and mingled. The thing in the depression was not simply resting. It was waiting at the door, guarding it, keeping it open until its hunger was finally satisfied. We planned our expedition for the next new moon, 3 weeks away. We gathered supplies, studied maps, and prepared ourselves for what we might encounter. We did not speak of the danger, not directly, but it hung over all our conversations like a shadow. We knew that we might not survive. We knew that the one who waits was aware of us, that it had felt my presence in its chamber and might be waiting for our return. But we also knew that we could not turn back. Too many people had already been lost. Too many families had been destroyed. If there was any chance of stopping the cycle, we had to take it. The night arrived. We gathered at the newfound Gap parking lot as the sun was setting. 4 people who had nothing in common except a shared determination to face something that defied understanding. Clementine was calm and steady, her 70-plus years of waiting for answers having given her a patience that the rest of us lacked. Obadiah was quiet and focused, carrying with him a bundle of items he called sacred, things that his ancestors had used in their dealings with the spirits of the mountains. Sebastian was nervous, his academic confidence replaced by a visible tremor that he could not quite control. And I was afraid, more afraid than I had ever been, but also more certain that I was exactly where I needed to be. We started down the trail as darkness fell. The forest was different at night, transformed into something ancient and alien. The trees that had been familiar during the day became looming shapes, their branches reaching for us like grasping fingers. The trail that had been so easy to follow became treacherous, rocks and roots hidden in shadows, waiting to trip the unwary. We moved in single file, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness, and we did not speak. Speaking seemed wrong somehow, dangerous, as if our voices might draw attention from things that were better left unaware of our presence. The descent into the ravine took hours. By the time we reached the cave entrance, the moon had set completely, leaving a darkness so absolute that our flashlights seemed to barely penetrate it. I pushed aside the hanging vines and shone my light into the passage beyond. The pale fungus still glowed on the walls, but dimmer now, as if it too was affected by the darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The passage seemed longer than I remembered, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. I could hear the others behind me, their breathing quick and shallow, their footsteps scraping against the stone. The symbols on the walls seemed more active now, writhing and shifting in ways that made my eyes water when I looked at them. I kept my gaze forward and kept moving. We emerged into the chamber. It was exactly as I remembered it, vast and bowl-shaped, with the depression in the center where the sleeping thing lay coiled in impossible geometry. But something was different. The thing was no longer sleeping. I could feel its awareness pressing against me, a weight that went beyond the physical, a presence that seemed to fill every corner of my mind. It knew we were there. It had been waiting for us. Obadiah stepped forward and began to speak in Cherokee, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the walls of the chamber. The sacred items he carried began to glow, a soft light that pushed back against the darkness, and I saw the thing in the depression stir. It was waking. It was rising. The hollow ones came from the shadows. There were dozens of them, emerging from alcoves and passages that I had not noticed before, converging on our position with their jerking, puppet-like movements. Their blank faces turned toward us, and even without eyes, I could feel them seeing us, tracking us, preparing to take us. I raised my bear spray, knowing it was useless, knowing that nothing I had could harm these things, but unable to simply stand and wait for them to reach me. Clementine began to sing. It was a hymn, old and simple, something she had learned as a child in a small church in the mountains. Her voice was thin and quavering, but it cut through the darkness like a blade, and the hollow ones hesitated. They did not stop, but they slowed, their movements becoming less certain, as if her song was interfering with whatever force controlled them. Sebastian joined in, his voice finding the melody and adding to it, and I joined too. And then Obadiah, his Cherokee chant blending with our song in ways that should have been discordant, but instead felt like harmony. The thing in the depression screamed. It was not a sound that could be heard with ears. It was a sound that bypassed the senses entirely and went straight to the core of existence, a vibration of pure rage and hunger and frustration. The chamber shook. Rocks fell from the ceiling. The hollow ones collapsed, their forms dissolving into piles of sticks and mud and bone, and in the center of the room, the impossible shape of the one who waits began to thrash. Obadiah shouted something I could not understand and threw one of his sacred items toward the depression. It arced through the air, trailing light, and struck the thrashing form with an impact that sent shockwaves through the chamber. The thing screamed again, and the scream was different this time, weaker, more distant. The vast shape began to fade, to become translucent, as if it was being pulled back through the door from which it had come. But the door was not closing. I could feel it still open, a wound in the fabric of reality, a passage that the thing could use to return whenever it wished. We had heard it, but we had not stopped it. We had pushed it back, but we had not sealed it away. I ran toward the depression. I do not know what I intended to do. I had no sacred items, no ancient knowledge, no power beyond my own determination. But I ran anyway, and as I reached the edge of the depression, I saw something. There was a stone at the center of the bowl, black and smooth, and it was radiating a darkness that seemed to eat the light around it. The door. That was the door. That was what was keeping the passage open. I jumped into the depression. The contact with the retreating form of the one who waits was like being struck by lightning. Pain exploded through every nerve in my body, and I heard myself screaming, though the sound seemed to come from very far away. The thing wrapped around me, tried to pull me through the door with it, and I felt the cold of another world pressing against my skin. But I did not let go. I reached for the stone and closed my hands around it. The stone was ice and fire. It was emptiness and weight. It was everything terrible I had ever experienced compressed into a single point. But I lifted it anyway, my muscles burning with the effort, and I threw it through the fading shape of the one who waits, threw it into the darkness on the other side of the door. The door closed. The thing was gone. The depression was empty. The chamber was silent. I lay at the bottom of the bowl, my body broken and my mind reeling, and I looked up at the faces of my friends as they scrambled down to help me. Clementine was crying, Sebastian was laughing, Obadiah was praying, and I was smiling, because despite the pain, despite the terror, despite everything we had faced, we had won. The door was closed. The cycle was broken. The one who waits would not take anyone else. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from injuries that the doctors could not explain. Burns that looked like frostbite, muscle damage that suggested exposure to extreme pressure, psychological trauma that manifested in nightmares and flashbacks, and a terror of darkness that I have never fully overcome. The official story was that I had fallen during a solo hike and been rescued by my friends, which was true enough in the broadest sense. The real story was never told to anyone outside our group. Clementine died 3 years after our expedition, peacefully in her sleep, having finally found the closure she had been seeking since her brother's disappearance. She told me, in one of our last conversations, that the burden she had carried for so long had been lifted, that she could finally rest. I hope that rest was everything she deserved. Sebastian finished his dissertation and went on to become a professor of folklore at a small college in Virginia. He published a book about Appalachian legends that included, hidden among the other stories, an accurate account of what we had experienced. He framed it as fiction, of course, because no one would have believed it as fact, but those who knew what to look for could find the truth in his pages. Obadiah returned to his people and became an elder himself, a keeper of the old stories and the old ways. He taught the young ones about the bargain and the tribute and the importance of remembering what had been done to protect the mountains. He told them about the one who waits and the door and the night we had closed it forever. I visited him often, and we would sit together in silence, 2 old men who had faced something beyond understanding and survived. And I returned to the Smokies. I could not stay away. The mountains were in my blood, in my bones, in the very rhythm of my breathing. I resumed my duties as a ranger, patrolling the trails and helping the hikers in watching over the wilderness that had nearly claimed my life. But I watched with different eyes now. I saw the beauty of the forests, yes, the majesty of the peaks and the serenity of the valleys. But I also saw the shadows, the places where the light did not quite reach, the moments when the wind carried sounds that did not belong. The door was closed, but the mountains remembered. They would always remember. There have been no disappearances since our expedition, not one. The families who hike into the Smokies now hike out again, safely and without incident. The hollow ones have not been seen. The wooden figures have crumbled into dust. The cycle has ended, and the tribute is no longer required. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon is dark and the forest is still, I hear something in the distance. It is not the breathing, not exactly. It is more like a whisper, a voice speaking words I cannot quite understand, rising from beneath the mountains where the one who waits once slept. It is not a threat, not anymore. It is something else, something I have come to understand only gradually over the years since the door was closed. It is a promise. The door is closed, but doors can be opened. The cycle is broken, but cycles can begin again. The one who waits is gone, but it is patient, and it is old, and it has all the time in the universe to find another way. I am the last of those who remember. Clementine is gone. Sebastian rarely speaks of what we experienced. Obadiah is growing old, his memory fading with each passing year. Soon, there will be no one left who knows the truth, no one who can warn the next generation of what sleeps beneath the mountains. And so I write this account. I write it not for publication, not for recognition, not for any purpose except to ensure that the truth survives. I write it so that if the whispers ever become screams, if the cycle ever begins again, there will be someone who knows what to do. The Great Smoky Mountains are beautiful. They are ancient. They are wild in ways that defy the touch of human civilization, and they are watching. They are always watching. If you ever hike these trails, if you ever lose yourself in the endless green of these forests, remember what I have told you. Remember the hollow ones, and the wooden figures, and the thing that sleeps in the darkness. Remember the door that was closed, and the price that was paid to close it. And if you hear something following you through the trees, something with footsteps that sound almost human, but not quite, something with a breath that rises and falls like the tide of an endless sea, do not turn around. Do not answer when it calls your name. Just keep walking. Keep walking until you reach the light, and pray that the light is enough. I am an old man now. My hair has gone white, and my hands shake when I try to write, and my memories of the expedition have become soft around the edges, blurred by time into something that feels more like a dream than reality. But the mountains have not changed. They stand as they have always stood, ancient and patient, watching over the valleys and the rivers and the small human lives that flicker and fade beneath their gaze. The Smokies have a new generation of rangers now, young men and women who see the forest as a resource to be managed rather than a mystery to be feared. They do not believe in hollow ones or sleeping gods or doors between worlds. They believe in statistics and schedules and the proper protocols for search and rescue operations, and perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps the old fears should die with the old people who carry them. But I keep watching. Every year, on the anniversary of the night we close the door, I hike back to the place where the cave used to be. I say used to be because the cave is no longer there. Where once there was an opening in the rock, there is now only solid stone, as if the passage had never existed at all. The ravine where I camped is overgrown with new forest, the trees young and healthy, unmarked by the presence that once haunted these woods. The mountains have healed, and the scars of what happened have faded to nothing. But I still hear the whisper. It comes at the darkest part of the night, when the new moon hangs invisible in the sky and the shadows press close. It is faint, barely audible, easily dismissed as the wind or the rustle of leaves or the tricks that an old man's ears play on him in the silence. But I know what it is. I know who is speaking. The one who waits has not forgotten. The door is closed, but somewhere, in whatever darkness lies on the other side, the thing that took the Hargroves and the Thorntons and hundreds of others is still waiting. It is still hungry, and it is still searching for a way back. I cannot know if it will succeed. I cannot know if the door will ever open again, or if the cycle will ever resume. I only know that the mountains are old, older than memory, older than history, older than the very stones that form their bones, and in all that time, they have seen many things come and go. Empires have risen and fallen, species have evolved and gone extinct. The face of the earth itself has changed beyond recognition. But the mountains remain, and so does what lies beneath them. My advice to you, if you ever visit the Great Smoky Mountains, is simple. Hike the trails, take the photographs, marvel at the beauty of the waterfalls and the majesty of the ancient trees. Enjoy the peace and the solitude and the sense of connection with something larger than yourself. But do not stray from the path. Do not go into the forest after dark. And if you ever find yourself in a clearing where the trees grow in a perfect circle, if you ever come across a figure made of sticks and mud and bone, if you ever hear a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a breathing like the tide of some vast and hungry sea, run. Run and do not look back. Because some things in this world are older than human understanding, and some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. This is my warning. This is my legacy. This is the truth about the Great Smoky Mountains, and the thing that sleeps beneath them, and the night that 4 people faced the darkness and somehow, miraculously, lived to tell the tale. Remember it, because the mountains always remember, and they are always watching. They are always watching. They are always watching. I signed the contract in early June, inside a cramped Forest Service office that smelled of wet nylon and burned coffee. The woman behind the desk never looked at me, just slid the papers over and tapped where I needed to sign. Orientation was at 7 in the morning the next day. No welcome, no questions. The title sounded official, Natural Resources Technician. But the work was simple. Long boat runs, empty islands, reports no one read. I took every assignment they offered, especially the ones no one else wanted. Early departures, rough water, days without cell service, anything that kept me out of town. In Alaska, isolation was not a side effect of the job. It was the job. My name is Samuel Whitmore, and I came to the Tongass National Forest to disappear. Not in the literal sense, though after everything that happened, I understand how thin that line really is. I came because I needed distance from the life I had been living in Oregon, a failed marriage, a business that collapsed, a brother I could no longer speak to without shouting. Alaska promised silence, and for a while, it delivered. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the United States. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest spanning the Alexander Archipelago and the coastal mountains of southeast Alaska. Most people picture Alaska as a frozen wasteland, but the Tongass is different. It is wet, it is green, it is dense in ways that forests in the lower 48 cannot comprehend. The trees here, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, red cedar, grow so thick that sunlight becomes a rumor. The moss hangs from every branch like the hair of drowned women. The rain never stops, not really. It just pauses long enough to let you forget it is coming. I was stationed out of Ketchikan, a small town built on a rocky island at the southern tip of the archipelago. The locals called it the salmon capital of the world, though I never saw much evidence of that title during my time there. What I saw were fishing boats, float planes, and a constant gray ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down on everything. The town itself clung to the mountainside like it was afraid of falling into the water. The streets were steep, the buildings were old, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. I rented a room above a bait shop on Creek Street. The floor sloped, the walls were thin, and I could hear the water running beneath the building at all hours. It was perfect. I did not want comfort. I wanted to be reminded, constantly, that I was somewhere else, somewhere far from everything I had known. My supervisor was a man named Franklin Delacroix. He was 63 years old, had worked for the Forest Service for 41 years, and possessed the kind of quiet authority that made younger men listen without question. He was tall and lean, with a gray beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that had seen too much water. Franklin never raised his voice. He never needed to. When he told you something, you believed it. Not because he demanded belief, but because everything about him suggested he had earned the right to be taken seriously. On my third day, Franklin called me into his office, a converted storage room at the back of the Ketchikan Ranger Station. The walls were covered with maps, most of them hand-annotated with faded pencil marks. There were photographs too, black and white images of men standing in front of boats and cabins, their faces serious, their clothes soaked. Franklin gestured for me to sit. I did. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low and even, like a boat engine idling in calm water. "You came here to get away from something," he said. "That is not a question. I can see it in how you move, how you avoid eye contact, how you volunteered for the Hesida run before you even knew what it was." I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Franklin nodded slowly, as if my silence confirmed something he already knew. "That is fine," he said. "Most of the men who work this job are running from something. The forest does not care why you came. It only cares whether you can do the work." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach. "But I need to tell you something, Samuel. Something that is not in the manual. Something that orientation did not cover." I waited. Franklin's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the rain was falling in sheets, turning the harbor into a gray blur. "There are places in the Tongass that do not appear on any official map," he said. "Islands that the Forest Service knows about but does not acknowledge. Cabins that were built by men whose names have been forgotten. Trails that lead to nowhere, or worse, to somewhere." He paused, letting the words settle. "You will hear stories from the old-timers," he continued. "Stories about people who went into the forest and never came back. Stories about sounds in the night that do not match any animal in the region. Stories about things seen at the edge of the tree line, just before dark. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that I was too old for campfire tales, that I had not come to Alaska to be frightened by ghost stories. But something in his expression stopped me. He was not trying to scare me. He was trying to warn me. Most of those stories are nonsense, Franklin said. Exaggerations, misremembered details. The human mind does strange things when it is alone for too long. But some of those stories, Samuel, some of them are true. And if you work this job long enough, you will have your own story to tell. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I have been doing this for 4 decades, he said. I have seen things I cannot explain. Things I have never reported because no one would believe me. Things I have never told my wife or my children or anyone outside this office. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a man facing danger, but the slow, deep fear of a man who has lived with something terrible for a very long time. The Tongass is not just a forest, Samuel. It is something older. Something that was here before the Tlingit, before the glaciers, before anything that we would recognize as life. And it remembers. It remembers everything. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the conversation had drained something from him. I am not telling you this to scare you, he said. I am telling you this because you need to know. Because when you are out there, alone, and something happens that does not make sense, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to know that you are not crazy, that other men have seen what you will see, and that the best thing you can do when you see it is to leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, which he slid across the desk toward me. This is your first real assignment, he said. His voice had returned to its normal, business-like tone, as if the previous conversation had never happened. Hesita Island, 3-day survey. You will be checking on one of our remote cabins and documenting any wildlife activity in the area. Simple work. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside were maps, photographs, and a series of typed reports dating back to the 1970s. The cabin in question was located on the northern shore of Hesita Island, accessible only by boat. The nearest town was Craig, about 20 miles to the east. The reports were routine: weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes. Nothing unusual. You will leave tomorrow morning at 6, Franklin said. Take the whaler. Pack for 4 days, just in case the weather turns. There is a satellite phone in the cabin, but the reception is unreliable. If you need to reach us, use the radio. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back at Franklin. He was staring at the window again, his face unreadable. What happened to the last person who had this assignment? I asked. Franklin did not turn around. He quit, he said. After 3 weeks, said he could not sleep anymore. Said he kept hearing voices outside the cabin at night, voices that knew his name. I waited for him to continue, but he said nothing more. I left the office and walked out into the rain, the folder tucked under my arm, Franklin's words echoing in my head. The Tongass is not just a forest. It is something older, something that remembers. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was some kind of initiation ritual, a way of testing the new guy, seeing if he would spook easily. I had no idea how wrong I was. I had no idea what was waiting for me on Hesita Island. I had no idea that by the end of that summer, I would understand exactly what Franklin meant. And that understanding would change everything I thought I knew about the world, about the forest, and about myself. I left Ketchikan at 6 in the morning, just as Franklin had instructed. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and a light rain was falling, turning the harbor into a forest of masts and rigging that swayed gently in the early morning swell. The boat was a 22-foot Boston whaler, painted Forest Service green, with a center console and a canvas top that did little to keep out the rain. I loaded my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, first aid kit, rifle, ammunition, radio, flashlight, extra batteries, rain gear, maps, compass, notebook, camera, and cast off from the dock at 6:15. The crossing to Hesita Island took about 4 hours. I followed the inside passage, threading my way between islands that rose from the water like the humped backs of sleeping giants. The forest came right down to the shoreline on most of them, a solid wall of green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Occasionally, I would pass a fishing boat or a kayaker, but for the most part, I was alone on the water, surrounded by silence broken only by the steady drone of the outboard motor. I had studied the maps the night before, memorizing the route, noting the landmarks, identifying the hazards. Hesida Island was one of the larger islands in the archipelago, about 40 miles long and 10 miles wide at its widest point. Most of it was uninhabited, covered with old-growth forest that had never been logged. There were a few small settlements on the eastern shore, mostly fishing camps and seasonal cabins, but the northern shore, where the Forest Service cabin was located, was completely wild. The cabin itself had been built in 1932 by a man named Ezekiel Marsh. According to the reports in the folder, Marsh was a trapper who had come to Alaska during the Depression, hoping to make his fortune in furs. He built the cabin as a base of operations, spending his winters running trap lines through the forest and his summers fishing for salmon in the surrounding waters. He lived there alone for 18 years, until 1950, when he simply disappeared. His cabin was found empty, his boat still tied to the dock, his gear still inside. There was food on the table, as if he had been in the middle of a meal when something interrupted him. The Forest Service acquired the cabin in 1954 and had been using it as a remote station ever since. Dozens of rangers and researchers had stayed there over the years, conducting surveys, monitoring wildlife, maintaining trails. Most of them reported nothing unusual, but a few, a small but persistent minority, reported experiences that did not fit neatly into any official category. Strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, objects that moved when no one was looking, and in 3 separate cases, the same detail that Franklin had mentioned, voices outside the cabin that knew the listener's name. I arrived at Hesida Island just before 11 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, and a thick mist hung over the water, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. I followed the shoreline north, using my compass and the occasional landmark to navigate, until I spotted the cabin, a small wooden structure set back from the water on a low bluff, surrounded by towering spruce trees. The dock was old but sturdy, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. I tied off the whaler and climbed onto the planks, my boots echoing in the silence. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else. Something faintly organic that I could not identify. Decay, maybe, or moss, or something that had been dead for a very long time. The cabin was exactly as the photographs had shown it. A single-story structure with a pitched roof, a small porch, and 2 windows facing the water. The walls were made of hand-hewn logs, chinked with some kind of gray morite that had cracked and crumbled in places. The roof was covered with cedar shakes, many of them missing or broken. The door was painted red, though the paint had faded and peeled until it was more pink than anything else. I climbed the steps to the porch and tried the door. It was unlocked, as Franklin had said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dim and musty, lit only by the gray light filtering through the dirty windows. There was a single room, about 15 feet square, with a wooden floor, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and a small kitchen area in the back corner. The walls were bare except for a few hooks where previous occupants had hung their gear. There was a layer of dust on everything, and the air had that particular stillness that comes from long disuse. I set down my pack and walked slowly around the room, taking inventory. The fireplace was cold, the ashes long since turned to powder. The bed was made, the blankets folded neatly at the foot. The table was clear except for an old kerosene lantern and a stack of yellowed papers that turned out to be survey forms from 1987. The kitchen had a hand pump for water, a propane stove that looked like it dated from the 50s, and a row of cabinets that contained a few cans of beans, some instant coffee, and a family of mice that fled when I opened the door. In the back corner, I found the satellite phone and the radio, both mounted on a small shelf. I tested the radio first. It crackled to life, and I was able to raise the Ketchikan station on the second try. I reported my arrival, confirmed my schedule, and signed off. The satellite phone was another matter. When I picked it up, the screen was blank. I checked the battery, checked the connections, tried turning it on and off several times. Nothing. It was completely dead. I made a note in my notebook. Satellite phone inoperative. Will report to station on return, and continued my inspection. The last thing I found was a trapdoor in the floor, near the back of the cabin. It was about 3 feet square, set flush with the floorboards, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. I pulled it open and shone my flashlight into the darkness below. The beam revealed a small root cellar, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, with earthen walls and a dirt floor. There were a few shelves along the walls, holding jars of what looked like preserved vegetables, long since turned to brown sludge. There was also a wooden crate in the center of the floor, nailed shut. I climbed down the ladder and examined the crate. It was old, very old, and the wood was soft with rot. The nails were rusted, and when I pulled at one of the boards, it came away easily. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, were the personal effects of Ezekiel Marsh. There was a leather-bound journal, the pages brittle and yellow. There was a pocket watch, stopped at 3:17. There was a photograph of a woman I did not recognize, her face stern and unsmiling in the way of old portraits. And there was a knife. A hunting knife with a bone handle and a blade that was still sharp despite the decades. I took the journal and left the rest. I climbed back up the ladder, closed the trap door, and sat down at the table to read. The journal began in 1932, the year Marsh built the cabin. The early entries were mundane, notes about construction, weather observations, lists of supplies, accounts of successful hunts. Marsh wrote in a cramped, careful hand, his spelling inconsistent, but his meaning clear. He was a practical man, focused on survival, with little time for reflection or philosophy. But as I read further, the tone of the entries began to change. By 1935, Marsh was writing about things that did not fit the pattern of the earlier pages. He mentioned sounds in the forest at night, sounds that he could not identify, that did not match any animal he knew. He wrote about the feeling of being watched, a constant presence that he could sense but never see. He described dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams in which he wandered through the forest, searching for something he could never find, pursued by something he could never escape. In 1938, the entries became more fragmented. Marsh wrote about seeing figures at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin shapes that moved in ways that did not seem natural. He wrote about voices that called to him from the forest, voices that knew his name, that whispered secrets he could not quite hear. He wrote about losing time, hours, sometimes entire days, that he could not account for, that left no memory except a vague sense of dread. The final entry was dated October 15, 1949, 6 months before Marsh disappeared. It was shorter than the others, just a few lines scrawled in a hand that trembled. "It is here," he wrote. "It has always been here. I understand now. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me." I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, the weight of those words pressing down on me. Outside, the mist had thickened, and the forest was invisible, swallowed by a gray wall that seemed to press against the windows. The only sound was the soft drip of water from the eaves, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I told myself that Marsh was crazy, that 18 years alone in the wilderness had broken something in his mind, that the things he described, the sounds, the figures, the voices, were nothing more than the hallucinations of a man who had spent too long without human contact. I told myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. I told myself that I was not afraid. But as I sat there, in that dim and dusty cabin, listening to the silence of the forest, I felt something I had not expected, a sense of recognition. A feeling that I had been here before, in a place just like this, in a moment just like this, waiting for something I could not name. It was not fear exactly, it was more like anticipation, like the forest was watching me, weighing me, deciding what to do, and somewhere, deep in the trees, something was waiting. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my gear and making the cabin habitable. I swept the floors, aired out the blankets, checked the propane stove, and gathered enough firewood to last several days. The work was simple and physical, and it helped to quiet the unease that had settled over me since reading Marsh's journal. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and the mist had begun to lift. I walked down to the dock and stood there for a while, watching the water. The surface was calm, almost glassy, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees on the opposite shore. There were no birds, no fish jumping, no sound except the soft lap of water against the pilings. I had never been in a place so quiet. It was not peaceful, it was empty. As if the world had been drained of something essential, leaving only the shell behind. I returned to the cabin as the light began to fade. I cooked a simple dinner, beans, rice, coffee, and ate at the table, the kerosene lantern casting a flickering circle of light around me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been, and I found myself glancing toward the windows more often than was necessary, half expecting to see something looking back. After dinner, I took out my notebook and began writing my report. Wildlife observations, none so far. Weather conditions, overcast, light rain in the morning, mist in the afternoon, clearing toward evening. Cabin status, habitable but in need of repair. Satellite phone inoperative, radio functional. I was just finishing the last paragraph when I heard it. A sound, outside the cabin. Not loud, barely audible in fact, but distinct. A footstep. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The sound came again, and again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I set down my pen and listened. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of the cabin with a measured, unhurried pace. There was no variation in the rhythm, no hesitation, no acceleration. Just step, 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 like a metronome. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I reached for the rifle I had leaned against the wall and checked that it was loaded. Then I moved to the window and looked out. The light was almost gone, and the forest was a wall of black shapes against a dark gray sky. I could see the dock, the water, the first few feet of the path that led into the trees, but I could not see anything moving. No animal, no person, nothing. The footsteps continued. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see. The sound was coming from the other side of the cabin now, from the direction of the forest. Step, step, step. Always the same rhythm, always the same pace. I crossed to the other window and looked out. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the impenetrable darkness of the forest at night. But the footsteps were closer now. I could hear them clearly, just outside the wall, no more than 10 feet away. Step, step, step. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, not the natural silence of the forest at night, but something deeper, something heavier. A silence that seemed to have weight, that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin like water. I stood at the window, rifle in hand, waiting. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. My breath was shallow, rapid. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of the cabin, to get to the boat and leave this place and never come back. But I did not move. I could not move. I was frozen, trapped by something I did not understand, held in place by a force that was not physical but was just as real. And then I heard it. A voice. Samuel. My name. Spoken softly, almost tenderly, like a mother calling a child in for dinner. Spoken from just outside the window, no more than a few inches away. Samuel. I cannot describe the terror I felt in that moment. It was not the fear of physical danger. I have faced bears. I have faced storms. I have faced all the ordinary hazards of life in the wilderness. This was something different, something primal, something that reached into the deepest part of my brain and triggered instincts I did not know I had. I stumbled backward, away from the window, and tripped over the chair. I fell hard, the rifle clattering away across the floor. I scrambled to my feet and backed into the corner, as far from the windows as I could get, my eyes fixed on the glass. Samuel. The voice was moving now, circling the cabin, just as the footsteps had done. Samuel, come outside. Samuel, I want to show you something. Samuel. I grabbed the lantern from the table and held it up, as if the light could protect me. The flame flickered and danced, casting wild shadows on the walls. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness, but I could feel it, a presence, just outside, watching, waiting. The voice continued, soft and patient. Samuel, you came here to disappear. I can help you. Samuel, I know what you are running from. I know what you did. Samuel, come outside. Let me show you. I do not know how long I stood there, in that corner, listening to the voice. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the voice, and the darkness, and the unbearable weight of the silence between each word. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The voice fell silent. The darkness outside the window seemed to recede, to thin, to become ordinary again. The pressure in my chest eased, and I found I could breathe. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, the lantern clutched in my hands, my whole body shaking. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and watched the windows until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the glass. When the sun finally rose, or what passed for a sunrise in that perpetually overcast place, I got up, packed my gear, and walked down to the dock. I was going to leave. I was going to get in the boat and go back to Ketchikan and tell Franklin that he could find someone else for this assignment. I was done. I was finished. I was not going to spend another night in that cabin. But when I reached the dock, I stopped. The boat was gone. The whaler was no longer tied to the pilings. There was no sign of it, no rope, no debris, nothing floating in the water. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the boat should have been. And then, slowly, I turned and looked back at the cabin. It sat there on its low bluff, surrounded by trees, quiet and still in the early morning light. And I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my bones, that I was not leaving. Not yet. Not until the forest was finished with me. I spent the morning searching for the boat. I walked the entire shoreline of the bay, pushing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen trees, looking for any sign of where the whaler might have drifted. I found nothing. No wreckage, no tracks, no indication that the boat had ever been there at all. By midday, I was exhausted and frustrated. I returned to the cabin and tried the radio, hoping to reach the Ketchikan station and report my situation. The radio crackled and hissed, but I could not raise anyone on any frequency. Static, nothing but static, as if the signals were being swallowed by something between me and the rest of the world. I was alone, truly alone, cut off from civilization, from help, from any possibility of rescue. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away, across water I had no way to cross. I had food for a few more days, water from the pump, shelter, but I was trapped. I sat down at the table and tried to think. There had to be a rational explanation. The boat must have come loose during the night. A faulty knot, a frayed rope, something I had overlooked. It had drifted away with the tide, and I had simply not been able to find it. The radio was malfunctioning. These things happened in remote areas, especially in weather like this. There was nothing supernatural about any of it. Just bad luck, just coincidence. But even as I told myself these things, I knew I did not believe them. I thought about the voice, the footsteps, the way my name had been spoken, with that soft, patient certainty. Whatever was happening here was not coincidence. It was intention. Something wanted me here. Something had taken the boat to make sure I stayed. I spent the afternoon gathering more firewood and taking stock of my supplies. I had enough food for 3 days, maybe 4 if I rationed carefully. The pump was working, so water was not a problem. I had the rifle and a box of 20 cartridges. I had the flashlight and extra batteries. I had matches, a knife, rope, a first aid kit. I had everything I needed to survive. But survival was not my main concern. My main concern was making it through the coming night. As the light began to fade, I barricaded the door and windows as best I could. I pushed the table against the door and wedged the chairs under the window frames. I built a fire in the fireplace, not for warmth, but for light, as much light as I could create. I placed the lantern on the table and lit every candle I could find. I wanted the cabin to be bright. I wanted there to be no shadows. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and waited. The hours passed slowly. The fire crackled and popped. The candles flickered, the wind picked up outside, and I could hear the trees creaking and swaying in the darkness. But there were no footsteps, no voice, no presence outside the windows, just the ordinary sounds of the forest at night, the wind, the rain, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. By midnight, I began to think that the previous night had been an anomaly, a one-time occurrence, perhaps triggered by my arrival, by my disturbance of the cabin and the cellar in the journal. Maybe I had been tested, and I had passed. Maybe whatever was out there had decided I was not worth the effort. I was just starting to relax, just starting to think about trying to sleep when I heard it. Not a voice this time. Not footsteps. Something else. Music. Faint, distant, carried on the wind. A melody I almost recognized, played on what sounded like a fiddle or a violin. It was coming from the forest, from somewhere deep in the trees. I went to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted enough to let through a sliver of moonlight. I could see the dock, the water, the first few rows of trees at the edge of the clearing, and I could see something else. A light, a flickering orange light deep in the forest. It was moving, weaving between the trees, appearing and disappearing, as if it were being carried by someone walking through the woods. The music continued, growing louder, clearer. I could hear it now. An old tune, something from another era, played with a skill that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. There was a wrongness to the melody, a dissonance that crept in at the edges, as if the musician were playing from a score that had been corrupted or altered. I watched the light for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was too far away to be a threat, too deep in the forest to be anything I needed to worry about. But I could not look away. There was something hypnotic about the combination of the light and the music, something that tugged at the edge of my consciousness, that whispered of secrets just beyond my understanding. And then the light stopped moving. It hovered there, in the darkness between the trees, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The music faded, replaced by silence, and I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that the light was not random. It was not wandering. It was waiting. It was waiting for me to come to it. I stepped back from the window and forced myself to look away. I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought, that if I went into the forest, I would not come back. Whatever was out there, Whatever was making that light, playing that music, it was not human, and it did not have my best interests at heart. I returned to my corner and did not look at the window again. The music started up once more, louder this time, closer. The melody had changed. It was faster now, more urgent, with a driving rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, but I could still hear it, still feel it vibrating in my chest, in my bones. Samuel. The voice was back, softer than before, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly over the music. Samuel. Come dance with me. Samuel. I have been waiting so long. Samuel. I pressed my hands harder against my ears. I started humming, singing, anything to drown out the voice. I recited the Pledge of Allegiance, the Lord's Prayer, the lyrics to every song I could remember. I talked to myself, to the walls, to anyone who might be listening. Anything to fill the silence, anything to keep that voice from getting inside my head. And somehow, I made it through. The music faded. The voice stopped. The light in the forest winked out, leaving only darkness. When dawn came, I was still in my corner, my throat raw from talking, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I had survived another night, but I knew I could not do this forever. I knew that whatever was out there, it was patient. It had all the time in the world, and sooner or later, it would get what it wanted. On the third day, I read more of Ezekiel Marsh's journal. I had been avoiding it, reluctant to delve deeper into the mind of a man who had clearly been driven mad by this place. But I was desperate. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to know if there was a way out. The middle sections of the journal were difficult to read. Marsh's handwriting had deteriorated, becoming cramped and erratic, the letters running together in ways that made many passages illegible. But I was able to piece together the general arc of his experience. Marsh had first noticed something wrong in the winter of 1934, about 2 years after he built a cabin. He had been running his trap lines, following a route he had traveled dozens of times before, when he realized he was lost. The forest had changed. Landmarks he knew were gone, replaced by trees and rocks that he did not recognize. He wandered for hours, growing increasingly disoriented, until he stumbled, quite by accident, back to the cabin. He had been less than a mile from home the entire time. After that, the incidents increased. He would hear voices calling his name in the forest, voices that sounded like people he knew, people from his past, people who were hundreds or thousands of miles away. He would see figures at the edge of his vision, always just out of clear sight, always gone when he turned to look. He would lose time, fall asleep in the afternoon, and wake up the next morning with no memory of the intervening hours. By 1940, Marsh had developed a theory. He believed that the forest was not just a collection of trees and animals, but a living thing, a consciousness, something old and vast and patient that had existed on this island long before humans arrived and would exist long after they were gone. He called it the presence, and he believed that it was interested in him, not hostile exactly, not friendly either, just interested, the way a scientist might be interested in a specimen under a microscope. It watches me, Marsh wrote. It studies me. It is learning. I do not know what it wants, but I know that it wants something, and I know that it will not let me leave until it gets it. The later entries were fragmentary and often incoherent. Marsh wrote about conversations with the presence, long rambling dialogues that he seemed to have conducted in his dreams. He wrote about visions, images of the island as it had been thousands of years ago, before the trees, before the ice, when it was just bare rock rising from a primordial sea. He wrote about promises, things the presence had offered him in exchange for his cooperation, power, knowledge, eternal life. In return for what, Marsh never made clear. But in the final entries, there were hints. The presence needs something, Marsh wrote. Something that only a human can provide. A bridge, a doorway, a way to cross from its world into ours. And it has chosen me. In his last entry, the one I had read on my first day, Marsh seemed to have made his decision. I understand now, he wrote. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me. And then he disappeared. I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, my mind racing. If Marsh was right, if there really was something in the forest, something ancient and intelligent and hungry, then I was in far more danger than I had realized. It was not just trying to scare me. It was not just playing games. It wanted something from me, and it was not going to stop until it got it. I thought about Franklin's warning. When you see it, leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. But I could not leave. The boat was gone. The radio was not working. I was trapped on an island with something that defied explanation, something that had driven one man mad and possibly killed him. I had two choices. I could stay in the cabin, barricade the doors, and wait for rescue that might never come. Or I could go into the forest. I could try to understand what I was dealing with. I could try to find a way to stop it, or at least a way to survive. Neither option was appealing, but I knew, even as I weighed them, which one I would choose. I had not come to Alaska to hide. I had come to face the things I had been running from, and if this forest wanted a confrontation, then a confrontation it would get. I left the cabin at noon on the third day. The weather had cleared somewhat, the rain had stopped, and the clouds had lifted enough to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The forest looked almost beautiful in the diffused light, the green of the trees vibrant against the gray of the rocks and the black of the still water. I brought the rifle, the flashlight, the compass, a length of rope, and a small pack with food and water. I also brought Marsh's journal, though I was not sure why. Perhaps I thought it might contain some clue I had missed. Perhaps I just wanted to have something to hold on to, some connection to another human being who had faced what I was facing. The path into the forest started at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. It was not an official trail, just a faint track worn into the undergrowth by the passage of feet over decades. Marsh's feet, probably, and the feet of others before him. I followed the path for about half a mile, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. The forest was dense here, the trees growing so close together that I could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. The light that filtered through the canopy was green and dim, like light at the bottom of a deep pool. I stopped frequently to check my compass and mark my trail. I did not want to get lost. I did not want to end up wandering in circles, the way Marsh had described. Every few hundred yards, I tied a strip of cloth to a tree branch, leaving a visible trail back to the cabin. After about an hour, the path began to climb. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. The trees thinned out slightly, replaced by dense thickets of devil's club and salmonberry that tore at my clothes and left scratches on my hands. I was sweating despite the cool air, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, without warning, I stepped out of the forest and into a clearing. It was not a natural clearing. The trees had been cut, recently judging by the freshness of the stumps, and arranged in a rough circle about 50 feet across. In the center of the circle was a structure. Not a cabin, not a shelter, something else. It was made of wood and bone and something that looked like dried seaweed, all woven together in an intricate pattern that hurt my eyes to look at. It was about 10 feet tall and vaguely conical, like a tipi or a hut, but the proportions were wrong. The angles did not match. The whole thing seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light, as if it were not quite solid, not quite real. I approached slowly, the rifle raised. There was no sound except the wind in the trees and the pounding of my heart. The structure had no door, no windows, no obvious opening of any kind. It was just a solid mass of woven material, dense and impenetrable. I walked around it once, twice, looking for a way in. On my third circuit, I noticed something I had missed before. There were carvings on the wooden poles that formed the structure's frame, figures, faces, scenes that I could not quite interpret but that filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. And at the base of one of the poles, almost hidden by the dense weave of the walls, there was a hole. Not a door, just a small opening about 2 feet across that seemed to lead into the interior of the structure. I knelt down and shone my flashlight into the hole. The beam revealed nothing but darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light, to drink it in and give nothing back. The air coming from the hole was cold and damp, with a faint smell that reminded me of caves, of old earth, of things long buried. Every instinct I had told me not to go inside. Every rational thought screamed that this was a trap, that whatever was in there was waiting for me, that I would never come out. But I had come this far. I had left the safety of the cabin. I had walked into the forest. I had found this place, or it had let me find it. There was no turning back now. I set down my pack and the rifle. They would be useless inside that narrow space. I kept the flashlight and the knife. Then I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. The passage was longer than I expected. 10 feet, maybe 15, a tunnel of woven branches and bone that pressed against me on all sides. The floor was soft, covered with something that felt like fur or moss. The walls were warm, which made no sense, warm and slightly damp, like the skin of a living thing. And then the passage opened up, and I found myself in a space that should not have existed. The interior of the structure was vast, far larger than the outside dimensions could possibly allow. I stood up and shone my flashlight around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The beam revealed walls that curved upward and outward, disappearing into darkness above. The floor was smooth, almost polished, made of some material that I could not identify. And everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on structures and objects that I could not name, there were carvings, faces, hundreds of faces, thousands of faces, human faces, etched into every surface, each one unique, each one frozen in an expression that was impossible to read. I walked deeper into the space, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The flashlight beam played across the faces, and I began to recognize some of them. There was a man who looked like my father, who had died when I was 12. There was a woman who looked like my ex-wife, her expression distant and sad. There was my brother, my boss, my neighbors, my friends, everyone I had ever known, everyone I had ever loved or hated or feared. And in the center of the chamber, carved larger than all the others, there was a face I knew better than any of them, my own face. I stopped and stared at it. It was perfect. Every line, every wrinkle, every scar. It was more than a carving. It was a portrait, a record, a claim. And as I stood there, looking at my own face looking back at me, I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned, raising the flashlight, and saw something that my mind refused to process. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the unseen ceiling. It was thin, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin was gray and smooth, like wet clay, and it had no face, just a blank expanse where a face should have been. But as I watched, paralyzed with terror, features began to emerge from that blankness. A mouth, eyes, a nose, my mouth, my eyes, my nose. It was wearing my face. "Samuel," it said, and its voice was my voice. "Welcome home." I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that wore my face. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. Time had no meaning in that place. Time was just another lie the world told itself. The thing did not move. It just stood there, watching me with my own eyes, smiling with my own mouth, waiting. Finally, I found my voice. "What are you?" I asked. The thing tilted its head, my head, in a gesture that was almost human. "I am what I have always been," it said. "I am the forest. I am the island. I am the memory of every creature that has ever lived here, and every creature that ever will. I am the beginning and the end. I am the thing that waits." Its voice was strange, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, all of them mine. It was deeply unsettling, hearing my own words come from something so alien. "You have been watching me," I said, calling my name, taking my boat, trapping me here. "Why?" The thing smiled, my smile. It was wrong on that face, stretched too wide, held too long. "Because you came to me," it said. "You signed the contract. You crossed the water. You entered my domain. You are mine now, Samuel. You have always been mine. You just did not know it." I shook my head. "I came here for a job, a simple job. Survey the cabin, document the wildlife, that is all." The thing laughed. My laugh, but hollow, echoing in that vast space. "You came here to disappear," it said. "You said so yourself. You wanted to be forgotten. You wanted to escape from everything you were. And I can give you that, Samuel. I can make you forget. I can unmake you. I can take everything you are, every memory, every regret, every fear, and absorb it into myself. You will become part of me, part of the forest, part of the island, forever." It stepped closer, and I stepped back, my heel hitting the wall behind me. I had nowhere to go. "You will not suffer," it said. "There is no pain in what I offer, only peace, only silence, only the end of everything that has ever hurt you. Is that not what you wanted? Is that not why you came?" I thought about my life. The marriage that had fallen apart, the business that had failed, the brother I had betrayed. All the mistakes, all the regrets, all the things I wished I could undo. The thing was right. Part of me had come to Alaska to disappear. Part of me had been hoping for exactly this, an end, a release, a way to stop running. But another part of me, the part that had survived 37 years in a world that did not owe me anything, that part was not ready to give up. "No," I said. The thing stopped. "What did you say?" I said no. I did not come here to disappear. I came here to start over, to build something new, to find out if there was still something left of me worth saving. And I am not going to let you take that from me. The thing's expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by something colder, harder. Something that was not quite anger, but was close. "You do not have a choice," it said. "You are in my domain. You are surrounded by my power. You cannot fight me. You cannot escape me. You can only accept what I offer." I tightened my grip on the knife in my hand. The blade was short, barely 6 inches. It would be useless against a creature like this, but it was all I had. "Then we have a problem," I said, "because I am not going to accept anything, and if you want me, you are going to have to take me." The thing stared at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, it began to change. The face that had been my face melted, reformed, became something else, something older, something that I recognized from the photographs in the cabin. Ezekiel Marsh. He did not resist, the thing said in Marsh's voice. He understood. He welcomed what I offered. He became part of me willingly. "And he is still here, Samuel. Still with me. Still at peace." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You killed him." "No. I freed him. He was trapped. Just like you. Trapped by his past, by his fears, by the weight of all the things he could not change. I gave him a way out. I gave him eternity. And I can give the same to you." It reached out a hand, Marsh's hand now, weathered and calloused, and touched my face. Its skin was cold, impossibly cold, like touching ice. "Just let go," it whispered. "Just surrender. It will be easier than you can imagine." And in that moment, I almost did. I felt the pull of it, the promise of oblivion, of peace, of an end to all the struggling and suffering that had defined my life. It would be so easy, so simple. Just close my eyes and let go. But then I thought about my brother, about the last conversation we had, before I left for Alaska, about the look on his face when I told him I was done, that I never wanted to see him again. I had been angry. He had been hurt. And we had parted in silence, with nothing resolved, nothing forgiven. I could not let that be the end. I could not let the last thing I did in this world be giving up. I twisted away from the thing's grip and slashed at it with the knife. The blade passed through its arm as if through smoke, and for a moment the creature's form wavered, became translucent, then reformed. It looked at me with Marsh's eyes, and there was something like surprise in its expression. "You resist," it said, "even now, even when there is no hope." "Why?" "Because hope is not the point," I said. "The point is not giving up. The point is fighting, even when you know you cannot win. That is what it means to be human." The thing was silent for a long moment, and then slowly it began to smile. Marsh's smile, but different somehow, almost approving. "Interesting," it said. "Very interesting." And then it was gone. Just like that. One moment it was standing in front of me, and the next moment I was alone in the chamber, surrounded by carved faces, with nothing but the echo of its voice in the darkness. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for it to return. But the minutes passed, and nothing happened. The chamber remained empty. The silence remained unbroken. Eventually I turned and made my way back to the tunnel, back to the crawlway, back to the outside world. When I emerged from the structure, the sun was setting. I had been inside for hours, though it had felt like minutes. The forest was quiet, the trees dark shapes against the fading sky. I gathered my pack and my rifle and made my way back along the trail I had marked, following the strips of cloth through the darkening woods. And as I walked, I felt something I had not expected. The sense of being watched was gone. The weight that had pressed down on me since I arrived, the constant, oppressive presence of the forest, had lifted. For the first time in 3 days, I felt alone. Truly alone. It was, I realized, the greatest gift the thing could have given me. It had let me. I made it back to the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, but I felt strangely at peace. Something had changed. I did not understand what or why, but I knew that the worst was over. That night, for the first time since I arrived, I slept. I did not dream. I did not hear voices or footsteps or music in the darkness. I simply closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted until morning. When I woke, I went down to the dock, half expecting to find it empty. But the whaler was there, tied to the pilings exactly as I had left it on the first day. The rope was intact, the knots secure. It was as if it had never been gone. I tried the radio, and it worked. I raised the Ketchikan station on the first try, reported my status, and requested an early pickup. Franklin himself came out to get me, piloting a larger boat through the early morning mist. He did not ask many questions. He just looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much and nodded slowly, as if he understood. On the ride back to Ketchikan, I told him what had happened. Not everything. Some of it I still could not put into words, but enough. The voices, the footsteps, the structure in the forest, the thing that wore my face. Franklin listened in silence, his hand steady on the wheel. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. "It let you go," he said. "That does not happen often. Most people who go as deep as you did, they do not come back. Or they come back different, changed, empty. You are lucky, Samuel, or blessed, or maybe you are just too stubborn to give up." I asked him what he thought the thing was, what it really was. He shrugged. "I do not know," he said, "and I have stopped trying to find out. The Tongass has been here for thousands of years, longer maybe. It has seen civilizations rise and fall. It has swallowed entire peoples without a trace. Whatever lives in those forests, whatever you encountered on Hesita Island, it is older than us, older than our understanding. And trying to understand it is like trying to understand the ocean or the stars. You can study it, you can measure it, but you can never really know it." He looked at me, and there was something like compassion in his eyes. "The best thing you can do," he said, "is accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some questions are not meant to be answered, and some places are not meant to be understood." He turned back to the wheel. "Just be grateful, Samuel. Be grateful that you made it out, and do not go back." I nodded. I understood. I never went back to Hesita Island. I finished my contract with the Forest Service, but I requested different assignments, always on the mainland, always in areas that had been thoroughly mapped and documented. I never again ventured into the unexplored corners of the Tongass, and I never again heard voices calling my name in the night. But I still think about that place. I still dream about it sometimes. The chamber under the earth, the carved faces, the thing that wore my face and spoke with my voice. And I wonder if it is still there, waiting. I wonder if it thinks about me too. I did not leave Alaska immediately after the Hesita assignment. Despite everything that had happened, I found that I was not ready to return to the lower 48. The life I had left behind was still there, waiting. The debts, the failures, the broken relationships. I was not ready to face them yet. So I stayed in Ketchikan, working smaller assignments, keeping my head down, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. And that was how I met the others. The first was a woman named Margaret Holloway. She was in her 50s, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood. She had worked for the Forest Service for 25 years, most of them in the Tongass, and she had a reputation for being hard to work with. People said she was cold, distant, antisocial, but I recognized something in her eyes, the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror every morning. We met by accident in a bar on Creek Street. She was sitting alone, nursing a whiskey, staring at nothing. I sat down next to her and ordered a beer. We did not speak for a long time. Finally, without looking at me, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You have been to one of the places," she said. "I can tell. The way you hold yourself, the way you flinch when someone says your name. You have seen things you cannot explain." I turned to look at her. She was still staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because I have been there too," she said, "more than once, and it changes you. It leaves a mark that never quite fades." She took a sip of her whiskey. "Mine was on an island called Coronation," she said. "I was doing a salmon survey in the summer of '92. 3 weeks alone, in a cabin that had been abandoned for decades. By the end of the first week, I knew something was wrong." She told me her story. It was different from mine in the details, but the essence was the same. The voices, the sense of being watched, the loss of time, the structure in the forest, in her case, a circle of standing stones covered with carvings that hurt to look at, and at the end, an encounter with something that defied explanation, something that had offered her a choice. "I chose to stay," she said, "just like you did, and it let me go, just like it let you go. But not everyone is so lucky, Samuel. Not everyone makes it out." She finished her whiskey and set the glass down on the bar. "There are others," she said. "Other people who have been to the places and survived. We do not talk about it publicly. No one would believe us, but we know each other. We find each other, and we share what we have learned." She turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something like warmth in her eyes. "You are not alone," she said. "You never were, and you never will be." Over the following weeks, Margaret introduced me to the others. There was Harold Pemberton, a retired biologist who had spent 30 years studying the wildlife of the Tongass. He had encountered the presence on a remote stretch of the mainland, near a glacier that had retreated so far it had exposed ancient rock that had not seen sunlight in 10,000 years. There was Dorothy Chen, a pilot who had been flying supplies to remote cabins when her plane went down on an island that was not on any map. She had spent 3 days in the forest before being rescued, and she had never flown again. There was William Redhawk, a Tlingit elder whose ancestors had known about the places for generations, who had been raised on stories of the spirits that lived in the deep forest and the prices they demanded. Each of them had their own story, their own encounter, their own scars. But they all shared the same fundamental experience. They had all been chosen by something in the forest. They had all been tested, and they had all survived. We began meeting regularly in a back room at the bar on Creek Street. We shared our stories, compared our experiences, tried to piece together some understanding of what we had faced. We called ourselves the survivors, though we never used that name in public. And slowly, over months of conversation and research, we began to develop a theory. The places, the islands, the caves, the clearings in the forest where the presence was strongest, were not random. They followed a pattern. They were clustered around certain geographic features, ancient volcanic formations, areas of unusual magnetic activity, sites that had been sacred to the Tlingit and other indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and they were connected. Not physically, but in some other way that we could not quite define, as if they were all part of a single network, a web of power that spanned the entire archipelago. Harold called it a mycelium, like the underground network of a fungus, connecting individual mushrooms that appeared to be separate organisms, but were actually parts of a single vast entity. The places were the fruiting bodies, the visible manifestations of something much larger, something that lived beneath the surface of the forest, beneath the surface of reality itself. It was a compelling theory, but it raised more questions than it answered. What was the entity? Where did it come from? What did it want? And why did it let some people go while others disappeared forever? We did not find answers, but we found something else, something almost as valuable. We found community. We found people who understood, who believed, who did not think we were crazy. And that, in the end, was enough. I stayed in Ketchikan for 3 more years after the Hasita incident. I continued working for the Forest Service, continued meeting with the survivors, continued trying to understand the thing that had changed my life. And then, in the spring of my 4th year, something happened that forced me to leave. Dorothy Chen disappeared. She had been doing better recently. The nightmares that had plagued her since her crash had started to fade. She had even talked about flying again, about overcoming the fear that had grounded her for so long. We thought she was healing. We were wrong. The night she disappeared, she left a note at the bar. It was addressed to all of us, but the message was simple. "It is calling me," she wrote. "I have to go back. I am sorry." We searched for her, of course. The Coast Guard, the Forest Service, the state troopers, everyone searched. They found her car at a trailhead on the mainland, near the site of her crash. They found her footprints leading into the forest. And then they found nothing. Dorothy was gone. Just like Ezekiel Marsh. Just like all the others who had ventured into the places and never returned. Her disappearance hit me hard. I had thought we were safe. I had thought that surviving the encounter meant we were protected somehow, that the presence had let us go and would not call us back. But Dorothy's note suggested otherwise. The calling never stopped. It just waited. And sooner or later, it would find a moment of weakness, a crack in the armor, and it would pull us back. I realized then that I could not stay in Alaska. Not because I was afraid, though I was, desperately afraid, but because I knew that the longer I stayed, the more likely I was to hear the calling too. The Tongass was in my blood now. It had marked me, claimed me, made me part of itself in some way that I could not undo. If I stayed, I would eventually follow Dorothy into the trees, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. I left Ketchikan at the end of that summer. I said goodbye to Margaret and Harold and William, to Franklin and the others who had become my friends. I packed my few possessions into a duffel bag, bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, and walked away from the only place I had ever felt like I belonged. I have not been back since. It has been 12 years now. I live in a small town in eastern Washington, as far from the coast, as far from the forest, as I could get without leaving the Pacific Northwest entirely. I work as a bookkeeper for a local hardware store. I live alone. I do not talk about what happened. But I still think about it. Every day. Every night. I think about the cabin on Hesita Island. I think about the chamber under the earth. I think about the thing that wore my face and offered me oblivion. And I think about my friends, the ones who survived and the ones who did not. Most of all, I think about the calling. I have not heard it since I left Alaska, not once in 12 years. But I know it is still there, waiting. I know that the presence has not forgotten me. And I know that someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now, maybe on my deathbed, I will hear it again. Samuel, it will say, come home. And I do not know if I will have the strength to resist. Last month, I received a letter from an attorney in Ketchikan. Franklin Delacroix had passed away, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 75. He had named me in his will. The inheritance was modest, a few $1,000s, some personal effects, a box of old photographs. But there was one item that caught my attention, a key. The attorney explained that Franklin had owned a small piece of property on the outskirts of town, a cabin, really, that he had built himself in the 70s. He had never used it, the attorney said. He had just held on to it all those years, waiting for the right person to give it to. Apparently, I was that person. I did not know what to think. I had not spoken to Franklin in over a decade. I had sent him a Christmas card every year, and he had sent one back. But that was the extent of our contact. I had assumed he had forgotten about me, moved on, found other young rangers to mentor and warn, but he had not. He had remembered, and in the end, he had chosen me. I thought about selling the cabin site unseen. I thought about throwing the key away and pretending I had never received the letter. I thought about 100 different ways to avoid dealing with what Franklin's gift represented. But in the end, I did none of those things. I booked a flight to Ketchikan. I rented a car at the airport, and I drove out to the cabin, following the directions the attorney had given me, through the rain-soaked streets of the town and up into the hills that overlooked the harbor. The cabin was small, just one room, with a wood stove and a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the water. It was old, weathered, covered with moss and lichen, but it was solid. It had been built by hands that knew what they were doing, by a man who understood how to create something that would last. Inside, on the table, there was an envelope with my name on it. I opened it and found a letter, written in Franklin's careful, measured hand. Samuel, it said, if you are reading this, then I am gone. Do not mourn for me. I have lived a long life, longer than I expected or perhaps deserved, and I have made my peace with whatever comes next. I am leaving you this cabin because I believe you will understand why I built it. It faces east, away from the islands, away from the forest, away from all the places where the presence is strong. I built it as a refuge, a place where I could go when the calling became too loud. I never told anyone about it. I never brought anyone here. It was my secret, my sanctuary, my last line of defense against the thing that wanted to claim me. I do not know if you still hear the calling. I do not know if the presence still thinks about you the way it thought about me and about all the others. But I know that it never truly lets go. And I know that someday you might need a place to hide. This cabin is that place. Use it when you need it. Stay as long as you need to stay. And remember what I told you all those years ago. The forest does not care why you came. It only cares whether you can do the work. And the work, Samuel, is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live, even when every fiber of your being is telling you to walk into the trees and let the darkness take you. That is the only victory we can hope for. That is the only thing we can control. I have faith in you, Samuel. I always have. Franklin. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in the silence of the cabin, listening to the rain on the roof. And then I set it down and walked to the window and looked out at the view. The harbor was spread out below me, gray and glittering in the afternoon light. Beyond it, I could see the islands of the archipelago, stretching away into the mist like the humped backs of sleeping giants. And beyond them, invisible but present, the vast green expanse of the Tongass National Forest. The thing was still out there. I could feel it, even now, even from this distance. A faint tug at the edge of my consciousness, a whisper so soft it was almost silence. Samuel, come home. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table. I picked up Franklin's letter and read the last paragraph one more time. The work is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. Then I picked up the key and held it in my hand, feeling its weight, its solidity, its promise. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if I would hear the calling again, or when, or what I would do if I did. But I knew one thing. I was not going to give up. Not today. Not ever. I was going to survive. I was going to do the work. And if the presence wanted me, it was going to have to wait. I stayed in the cabin for a week. I told myself I was just clearing out Franklin's belongings, putting his affairs in order, doing the practical things that needed to be done. But the truth was simpler. I needed time. Time to think. Time to remember. Time to decide what came next. On the 5th day, I found something I had not expected. Hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards, there was a journal. Not Ezekiel Marsh's journal. I had returned that to the Forest Service years ago. But Franklin's. It was thick, leather-bound, filled with decades of careful handwriting. I read it over the next 2 days, sitting by the wood stove, watching the rain fall outside the window. It was, in many ways, a history of the places. Franklin had been documenting them for over 40 years. Every encounter, every disappearance, every survivor's story he could verify. He had maps showing the locations of the structures. He had photographs of the carvings. He had transcriptions of Tlingit oral histories that described the presence in terms that predated European contact by thousands of years. And he had theories, dozens of theories, spanning the scientific and the spiritual, the rational and the mystical. Some of them were familiar: the mycelium hypothesis, the ancient entity theory, the idea that the presence was a kind of collective unconscious made manifest. But others were new to me. One theory in particular caught my attention. Franklin believed that the presence was not hostile, not exactly. It was hungry, that much was clear, but its hunger was not malicious. It was more like the hunger of a plant for sunlight or a river for the sea. It was simply trying to fulfill its nature. The presence fed on consciousness, Franklin wrote, on memory, on identity. It absorbed the minds of those who came to it, not to destroy them, but to incorporate them, to add their experiences to its own, to grow. And the people it absorbed, they were not dead. Not exactly. They were still there, somewhere inside the presence, preserved like insects in amber, still thinking, still remembering, still aware. They had simply become part of something larger. Franklin did not know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. He did not know if the absorbed minds experienced peace or torment, freedom or imprisonment. But he believed, based on his own encounters, based on the testimonies of survivors, based on the strange sense of recognition that sometimes came to him in dreams, that they were not lost, that they were, in some sense, still there, waiting. This theory changed everything. If Franklin was right, then the presence was not an enemy. It was not evil. It was simply different, so different that human categories like good and evil, life and death, did not apply. And the choice it offered, the choice between absorption and survival, was not a choice between existence and oblivion. It was a choice between 2 different kinds of existence, 2 different ways of being. I put down the journal and sat in silence for a long time. I thought about Ezekiel Marsh, who had accepted the presence's offer and walked into the forest, never to return. I thought about Dorothy Chen, who had resisted for years, but had finally heard the calling she could not ignore. I thought about all the others, the ones who had disappeared, the ones who had survived, the ones who were still out there, still fighting, still choosing to live. And I thought about myself, about the choice I had made, all those years ago, in the chamber beneath the earth, about the thing that had worn my face and offered me oblivion, about the calling that still whispered at the edge of my hearing, soft and patient and eternal. You came here to disappear, it had said. I can help you. I had refused. I had chosen to survive. But now, reading Franklin's journal, I wondered if I had understood the choice I was making. If I had known what the presence really was, not an enemy, but a kind of ecosystem, a collective consciousness that absorbed and preserved everything it touched, would I have made the same decision? Would I have fought so hard to remain myself, to remain separate, to remain alone? I did not know. I still do not know. But I know this: the choice was mine to make. And that is what matters, not the outcome, not the consequences, just the fact that I had a choice, and I made it, and I have lived with it ever since. I left Ketchikan on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after I had arrived. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky was clear for the first time since I had landed. The island sparkled in the early light, green and gold and impossibly beautiful. I drove to the airport slowly, taking the long way, savoring the view. I had decided to keep the cabin. I did not know when I would use it or if I would ever come back. But it felt important to have it, a refuge, a sanctuary, a place to run to when the calling became too loud. At the airport, I parked the rental car and walked to the terminal. I was early. My flight did not leave for another 2 hours, so I sat by the window and watched the planes take off, one after another, rising into the sky and disappearing into the distance. And as I sat there, I thought about everything that had happened: the contract, the crossing, the cabin, the chamber, the choice. I thought about Franklin and Margaret and Harold and Dorothy and all the others. I thought about the presents, whatever it was, wherever it had come from. And I thought about myself, about the man I had been before Alaska, and the man I had become since. I was not the same person. That much was obvious. The experiences I had had, the things I had seen, the choices I had made, they had changed me in ways I was still trying to understand. But I was still here, still breathing, still choosing every day to get up and face the world and do the work of living. That had to count for something. The boarding call came, and I stood and gathered my bag. I walked down the jetway and found my seat and buckled in. The plane taxied to the runway and paused, engines roaring, and then we were moving, faster and faster, until the wheels left the ground and we were airborne, climbing into the clear blue sky. I looked out the window and watched Ketchikan fall away below me, the town, the harbor, the islands, the forest, all of it shrinking, receding, becoming small and distant and finally invisible. And somewhere down there, hidden in the green shadows of the Tongass, the presence was watching. I could feel it. A faint tug at the edge of my consciousness, a whisper so soft it was almost silence. Samuel. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my seat. I did not respond. I did not need to. The presence knew where I was. It knew where I was going. And it would be waiting, patient and eternal, whenever I was ready to return. If I was ever ready. The plane leveled off, and the flight attendant came by with drinks. I ordered a coffee and a water and sat in silence, watching the clouds drift past outside the window, and I thought about what Franklin had written in the last line of his journal. The work is surviving. The work is refusing to give in. The work is standing up every morning and choosing to live. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. The work continues, I thought, and I am not done yet. That was 2 years ago. I am back in Washington now, back in my small town, back in my quiet life. I still work at the hardware store. I still live alone. I still do not talk about what happened. But something has changed. I am no longer afraid. Not of the presence, not of the calling, not of anything. I have stared into the abyss, as the old saying goes, and the abyss stared back, and I survived. That does not make me special. It does not make me a hero. It just makes me someone who has seen what is out there, in the dark places of the world, and has chosen to keep living anyway. That is all any of us can do, really. Make our choices, live with the consequences, and hope that when the darkness comes, as it always does sooner or later, we will have the strength to face it. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if I will ever hear the calling again, or if I will have the strength to resist if I do. But I know one thing. I am grateful. Grateful for the years I have had. Grateful for the experiences, even the terrible ones. Grateful for the people who helped me along the way. Franklin, Margaret, Harold, William, Dorothy, and all the others. And grateful, most of all, for the chance to tell this story. To put it down in words. To share it with anyone who might be listening. Because that is the other thing I have learned in all my years of running and hiding and surviving.